It was late in his life, when the noise of Hollywood had finally faded, that the contradictions around Clint Eastwood became impossible to ignore. To the public, he was still the quiet hero, the man who spoke softly and carried unshakable authority. But behind that image was a colder truth. Eastwood never shouted, he never explained himself. When something broke, he walked away and never looked back. Love turned into litigation. Admiration hardened into rivalry. Political disagreements became permanent lines in the sand. These were not rumors whispered by tabloids, but documented fractures that followed him for decades. And at the top of that list stood the woman who knew him better than anyone else. The relationship that exposed his most ruthless side. Sondra Locke. For 14 years, Clint Eastwood and Sondra Locke lived as one of Hollywood's most private power couples. They shared homes, projects, and a public image that suggested stability and mutual respect. Yet the relationship was built on an imbalance that few outside their circle fully understood. Eastwood was already a towering institution, with control over studios, budgets, and access. Locke's career, increasingly, passed through him. What looked like partnership often functioned as permission. When the relationship ended in 1989, it did not dissolve through conversation or closure. It ended through action. Eastwood changed the locks on the house they shared and had Locke's belongings boxed and removed while she was away. There was no warning, no negotiation, no space for response. The message was unambiguous. The door was shut, and it would not reopen. The breakup might have remained a private cruelty if not for what followed. Locke filed suit, accusing Eastwood not only of emotional harm but of calculated deception designed to dismantle her future. At the center of the case was a settlement that appeared, on paper, to secure her directing opportunities at Warner Brothers. Publicly, it looked like a fair compromise. A quiet resolution between two powerful figures. Privately, Locke alleged, it was something else entirely. She claimed Eastwood had secretly paid the studio to guarantee that she would never be hired, transforming the agreement into a mechanism of silence rather than support. The allegation cut deep because it reframed Eastwood's discipline as strategy. This was not anger in the heat of separation. It was premeditation. Court filings exposed a side of Hollywood that thrived on deniability. Money moved discreetly. Promises existed without intention. The power dynamic became the story. Locke argued that the settlement functioned as a muzzle, preventing her from speaking while ensuring professional isolation. The case dragged a revered figure into an uncomfortable spotlight. Eastwood denied wrongdoing, maintaining that he had acted within legal bounds. Yet the evidence revealed a chilling truth. Legality and fairness were not the same thing. The eventual settlement required Eastwood to pay a substantial sum, an acknowledgement not of guilt, but of risk. For Locke, the outcome was hollow. The years lost to litigation could not be recovered, and her career never regained momentum. Opportunities vanished. Invitations stopped coming. The industry, ever cautious, chose distance. What made the episode especially devastating was its finality. There was no reconciliation, no public regret, no attempt to soften the damage. Eastwood did not explain himself. He did not defend his character beyond formal statements. He moved on. That silence, for many longtime admirers, redefined his legend. The stoic hero was no longer merely reserved. He was capable of erasing someone from his life with precision and patience. Locke, by contrast, became a cautionary tale about proximity to power. Her story lingered as a warning whispered in private conversations, rarely spoken aloud. This conflict stands first because it exposes the core of Eastwood's personal code. Loyalty was conditional. Independence was non-negotiable. When a relationship threatened control, it was not repaired. It was neutralized. The love story that once symbolized Hollywood romance ended as a legal case study in dominance and consequence. For audiences who grew up believing in Eastwood's moral clarity, the Locke case remains the most unsettling chapter. It suggests that behind the calm exterior lived a man who did not need to raise his voice to destroy what stood in his way. He simply closed the door and ensured it stayed closed. For audiences over 60, the clash between Clint Eastwood and John Wayne feels almost mythic. Both men embodied the American West, yet they stood for radically different eras. Wayne represented the classical cowboy, moral clarity, communal justice, and a frontier where violence served order. Eastwood arrived as the antithesis. His characters were solitary, morally ambiguous, and willing to cross lines the old Western never acknowledged. As Eastwood's star rose in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Wayne watched with unease. To him, Eastwood's success did not renew the genre, it distorted it. The tension remained largely unspoken until Eastwood directed High Plains Drifter. The film's brutality, revenge-driven narrative, and bleak moral universe struck Wayne as a betrayal of everything the Western stood for. Rather than issue a public rebuke, Wayne chose a more personal route. He wrote Eastwood a handwritten letter direct, severe, and unmistakably disappointed. In it, Wayne accused Eastwood of making a film that mocked the very myths that had defined the frontier on screen. He argued that High Plains Drifter portrayed the West as cruel and corrupt, undermining the values that generations of Americans associated with the genre. For Wayne, this was not an artistic disagreement. It was a moral one. Eastwood's response was silence. He did not answer the letter. He did not soften his approach. He did not seek Wayne's approval or attempt reconciliation. Instead, he continued making films that pushed the Western further into darkness, embracing violence and ambiguity as truths rather than deviations. The silence spoke volumes. To Eastwood, Wayne's criticism belonged to a past he had already left behind. Engaging would have meant conceding authority. Ignoring it affirmed independence. What followed was not a feud in the tabloid sense, but a permanent distance. The two men never collaborated. They never publicly resolved their differences. Wayne continued to speak of the Western as a moral inheritance, something to be protected. Eastwood treated it as a canvas for interrogation, stripping away heroism to expose consequence. Hollywood, caught between reverence and evolution, allowed both legacies to coexist without forcing a reckoning. Yet among insiders, the divide was understood. This was not competition for roles or accolades. It was a collision between philosophies. For older viewers, the weight of this conflict lies in what it represents. Wayne was the last guardian of a myth. Eastwood was the man who dismantled it. Wayne believed the Western should offer reassurance. Eastwood believed it should offer truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Their inability to reconcile reflected a broader cultural shift, one that mirrored America's changing relationship with authority and violence. Eastwood's refusal to engage was not cowardice, it was a declaration. He would not inherit the genre on Wayne's terms. This clash earns its place on the list because it marked Eastwood's full departure from the past. In choosing silence over apology, he accepted the cost of alienating an icon. For Wayne, the letter was a warning. For Eastwood, it was confirmation that he was on the right path. Two kings, one frontier, and no room to share the crown. The Western survived, but it was never the same again. The clash between Clint Eastwood and Spike Lee did not grow out of personal history or private betrayal. It erupted in public, shaped by race, politics, and the question of who gets to define historical truth. When Eastwood released Flags of Our Fathers, a World War II film focused on the Battle of Iwo Jima, Spike Lee criticized the movie for excluding black soldiers, arguing that African Americans had fought and died in the Pacific Theater and deserved recognition on screen. To Lee, the absence was not a creative choice, but a political statement, one that perpetuated a selective version of history. Eastwood rejected the criticism outright. He did not frame his response as a misunderstanding or invite debate. Instead, he drew a hard line. In interviews, he stated that his film followed the historical record of the specific event portrayed and that casting decisions should not be reshaped to satisfy contemporary political expectations. Then came the sentence that crystallized the conflict. Referring to Lee, Eastwood said that, "A guy like him should shut his face." The phrasing was blunt, dismissive, and unmistakably personal. It signaled that Eastwood viewed the critique not as good faith disagreement, but as an intrusion into his authority as a filmmaker. The reaction was immediate. Commentators accused Eastwood of insensitivity, while supporters praised his refusal to bend to what they saw as ideological pressure. For older audiences, the exchange felt like a collision between generations. Spike Lee represented a Hollywood that demanded inclusion as a moral imperative. Eastwood represented an older creed, the belief that art answers first to facts, not to movements. Neither man backed down. Eastwood did not apologize or clarify. Lee did not retract his criticism. The disagreement hardened into a symbolic standoff. What made this conflict especially revealing was Eastwood's tone. Unlike the quiet withdrawals that defined other ruptures in his life, this was confrontational and public. The silence that usually followed his disagreements did not come immediately. Instead, he used dismissal as a weapon, reducing Lee's argument to noise unworthy of engagement. It was a rare glimpse of Eastwood's temper when his authority was questioned. The message was clear. History, as he chose to tell it, was not open to negotiation. Behind the scenes, the tension grew uncomfortable enough that Steven Spielberg reportedly stepped in to calm the situation, urging both men to de-escalate. The intervention prevented the clash from spiraling further, but it did not resolve it. There was no reconciliation, no collaborative future. The distance remained. This conflict earns its place on the list because it exposed Eastwood's worldview with unusual clarity. He did not see himself as a provocateur or a provocated party. He saw himself as a guardian of narrative authority. When challenged, he did not argue the point endlessly. He shut the door. For Spike Lee, the exchange underscored a generational divide that still shapes Hollywood. For Eastwood, it reinforced a lifelong position. His films would answer to history as he interpreted it, not to the politics of the moment. In drawing that line, he accepted controversy as the price of control. The conflict between Clint Eastwood and Michael Moore did not emerge from cinema aesthetics or personal history. It came from ideology, and it unfolded in front of witnesses. Moore, the most visible liberal documentarian of his generation, built his reputation attacking gun culture, corporate power, and conservative politics. Eastwood stood on the opposite side. A lifelong believer in individual responsibility and gun rights, he viewed Moore's activism as moral theater rather than honest inquiry. Their worlds were destined to collide, and when they did, Eastwood did not soften his response. The flashpoint arrived during an award season gathering where Moore's presence symbolized Hollywood's liberal consensus. In a moment that stunned the room, Eastwood addressed Moore directly. He warned that if Moore ever showed up at his home with a camera, he would be shot. At first, some laughed, assuming the remark was a provocation or dark humor. Eastwood did not smile. He repeated himself, clarifying that he was serious. The laughter stopped. The statement landed not as metaphor, but as boundary. For Eastwood, this was not a debate about policy. It was about trespass, autonomy, and the limits of intrusion. The aftermath split observers along familiar lines. Critics condemned the comment as reckless and intimidating, proof that Eastwood's politics had hardened into hostility. Supporters defended it as blunt honesty, arguing that Moore's confrontational tactics invited confrontation in return. Eastwood did not retract the statement. He did not issue an apology or explanation. He allowed the words to stand exactly as spoken. That refusal to recalibrate was the point. Eastwood had drawn a line and saw no reason to blur it for public comfort. What made the episode revealing was not the threat itself, but the philosophy behind it. Eastwood rejected the premise that public figures owed activists access or patience. To him, Moore's style represented an erosion of personal sovereignty, a belief that moral urgency justified intrusion. Eastwood's response reframed the conflict as one of property and agency. You do not cross the threshold uninvited. You do not turn a private life into spectacle without consequence. In that framing, the threat was not about violence. It was about deterrence. The industry's reaction was cautious. Studios avoided comment. Colleagues stayed neutral. The moment passed without formal fallout, but it lingered in Eastwood's public image. For older audiences, the incident reinforced a perception of him as uncompromising, even frighteningly so. This was not the measured stoicism of his films. It was a man asserting control in the most direct terms possible. Moore, for his part, did not pursue the confrontation. He referenced the episode obliquely, letting Eastwood's words speak for themselves. This conflict earns its place on the list because it illustrates how Eastwood handles ideological opposition. He does not negotiate. He does not seek middle ground. When faced with a worldview he rejects, he erects a barrier and defends it. The episode with Michael Moore distilled decades of political identity into a single sentence that could not be misunderstood. For Eastwood, the cost of clarity was controversy. For Moore, it was a reminder that not all disagreements in Hollywood end with speeches. Some end with doors closed and warnings delivered cold. In Eastwood's universe, that finality was not a flaw. It was the point. Unlike the other conflicts in Clint Eastwood's life, the tension with Meryl Streep was not born from romance, lawsuits, or shouted insults. It emerged from symbolism and public moral judgment. For decades, Eastwood and Streep represented two pillars of Hollywood excellence. Both were respected across generations, both carried immense cultural authority, and neither needed controversy to command attention. Yet politics drew a quiet but unmistakable line between them. The moment that crystallized this divide came in January 2017, during Meryl Streep's Golden Globe acceptance speech. Without naming Eastwood directly, she invoked his infamous 2012 Republican National Convention appearance, the empty chair monologue, and used it as a symbol of what she described as cruelty and irresponsibility in public discourse. The implication was clear. Eastwood had become shorthand for a Hollywood that enabled political harm through silence or complicity. For Eastwood, the speech was not an abstract critique. It was a public reframing of his identity by someone whose voice carried moral weight. He did not respond with outrage. He did not demand an apology. Instead, he issued a single, carefully measured line. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. The statement sounded neutral, almost polite, but those who understood Eastwood recognized it as closure. There would be no dialogue, no clarification, no attempt to reconcile positions. The distance was set. In Eastwood's world, public moral instruction was a form of intrusion. Once delivered, it changed the relationship permanently. What made this rupture resonate with older audiences was its restraint. There was no courtroom drama, no tabloid spectacle, just two legends drifting into separate moral universes. Streep continued to embody Hollywood's liberal conscience, speaking openly about politics and responsibility. Eastwood retreated further into silence, reinforcing his belief that conviction does not require performance. The absence of collaboration in the years that followed spoke louder than any statement. Mutual respect remained in theory, but proximity vanished in practice. This conflict earns its place on the list because it captures Eastwood's late-life posture toward Hollywood itself. He no longer argued, he no longer defended, he simply withdrew. In doing so, he transformed silence into a boundary. For Streep, the speech was an act of conscience. For Eastwood, it was a signal that the shared cultural ground had eroded. Neither appeared to regret the outcome. The separation was clean, unemotional, and final. With this final rupture, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Clint Eastwood does not explode. He does not negotiate endlessly. When confronted by lovers, legends, activists, or moral authorities, he closes ranks and steps away. The people left outside rarely return, and that may be the most revealing truth about the man behind the myth. His greatest weapon was never anger. It was distance. When the life of Clint Eastwood is viewed without the filter of myth, a consistent pattern emerges. Every major rupture followed the same logic. He did not argue to win people back. He did not apologize to restore harmony. He withdrew, decisively and without sentiment. Lovers became litigants. Fellow icons became strangers. Political opponents became lines that could not be crossed. What united these conflicts was not anger, but control. Eastwood believed authority, once challenged, must be reclaimed or abandoned entirely. There was no middle ground. For audiences who grew up admiring his restraint on screen, this reality is unsettling. The quiet hero was not gentle. He was disciplined, and discipline, when stripped of empathy, can look indistinguishable from cruelty. Unlike many Hollywood legends, Eastwood never sought absolution in old age. He wrote no confessional memoir to soften the past. He offered no tearful interviews reframing regret as wisdom. His silence was not an oversight. It was a philosophy. He believed that explanation weakens authority and that distance preserves dignity. In that worldview, forgiveness is not a virtue. It is a concession. Those who crossed him were not fought. They were erased. Careers stalled. Friendships cooled. Dialogues ended before they could begin. To some, this was strength. To others, it was emotional austerity mistaken for integrity. What makes Eastwood's legacy especially compelling for older viewers is its familiarity. He embodied an era where men were taught to endure rather than explain, to act rather than process. His conflicts reflect that code in its purest form. When love ended, it ended absolutely. When disagreement surfaced, it became permanent separation. There was no language for repair, only for exit. This approach built an unassailable image of self-sufficiency, but it came at a cost. The circle around him narrowed. The bridges behind him burned quietly, without smoke. As history reassesses Clint Eastwood, the question is no longer whether he was great. That is settled. The question is whether greatness requires distance, and whether silence, wielded long enough, becomes a form of power that leaves no room for reconciliation. Eastwood never answered that question. He lived it, and in doing so, he left behind a legacy defined not only by the films he made, but by the people he chose never to face again.